The rain was a black, oily curtain drawn across the world. It plastered the dead leaves to the cracked asphalt of the old highway, turning the road into a slick, treacherous ribbon. The wipers of my Jeep strained against the deluge, barely keeping a window clear enough to navigate. I was hours from anywhere, lost somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, a place the locals called the Devil's Teeth. I'd been chasing a story, a series of disappearances, whispered legends of strange lights in the sky, and rumors of a forgotten town swallowed by the wilderness. My editor thought I was chasing ghosts. Maybe I was. But the whispers had gotten under my skin, the unsettling sense that something ancient and malevolent was breathing just beyond the edge of the map. The road dipped sharply, descending into a valley so choked with trees that the already fading light vanished completely. The headlights cut a pathetic swathe through the oppressive darkness, revealing only a few feet of sodden earth and the looming, indistinguishable shapes of the forest. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying vegetation. An oppressive silence descended, swallowing the engine's hum and the drumming of the rain. Only the frantic thumping of my own heart remained. Then, I saw it. A flicker of movement, a pale shape at the edge of the headlights. I slammed on the brakes, the Jeep skidding precariously on the slick surface. I killed the engine, plunging the world into absolute darkness, broken only by the distant, malevolent flashes of lightning. The silence was deafening. My hand trembled as I reached for my flashlight. I clicked it on, the beam cutting through the rain and illuminating nothing. I swept the light back and forth, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. Just the relentless rain and the oppressive darkness of the woods. I told myself it was my imagination, fatigue playing tricks on my eyes. But the feeling of being watched, of something unseen lurking just beyond the reach of the light, was undeniable. It crawled under my skin, a cold, prickling sensation that raised the hair on the back of my neck. I restarted the engine, the sudden roar a jarring intrusion into the silence. I put the Jeep in gear and eased forward, my eyes scanning the darkness with a desperate intensity. A few minutes later, the road began to climb again, emerging from the valley into a slightly less oppressive darkness. I breathed a shaky sigh of relief, convincing myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Then, I saw the sign. It was barely visible in the fading light, a weathered wooden board nailed to a rotting post. The paint was peeling, the letters barely legible, but I could make out the name, Silent Hollow. Silent Hollow. It wasn't on any map. It wasn't mentioned in any historical records. It was just a name, whispered in hushed tones by the locals, a place they warned against, a place they said was cursed. I hesitated. I should turn back. I knew I should. But the journalist in me, the part of me that thrived on the strange and the unknown, wouldn't let me. Silent Hollow was the heart of the mystery, the key to the disappearances, the answer to the whispers. I turned onto the narrow, overgrown road leading towards the town. The pavement was cracked and broken, littered with debris and choked with weeds. The trees closed in around me, their branches intertwined overhead, creating a dark, claustrophobic tunnel. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof of the Jeep like a relentless heartbeat. After what felt like an eternity, the trees began to thin, and I saw it. Silent Hollow. It wasn't a town. It was a ruin. Buildings stood skeletal against the rain-streaked sky, their windows empty sockets staring out into the darkness. Roofs had collapsed, walls had crumbled, and nature had reclaimed everything, vines creeping over the stonework, trees growing through the foundations. It looked like a place that had been abandoned for centuries. The silence was absolute. Not even the wind dared to whisper through the broken streets. It was a silence that pressed in on you, a silence that felt heavy and malevolent. I parked the Jeep in the center of the town square, what little remained of it. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the air was still heavy with moisture and the smell of decay. I grabbed my camera, my notebook, and my flashlight, and stepped out into the silence. The ground was uneven, treacherous with broken bricks and overgrown roots. I moved slowly, cautiously, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, revealing the ruined buildings one by one. The first building I entered was the old church. The roof had collapsed, leaving the interior exposed to the elements. The altar was a pile of rubble, the stained glass windows shattered and broken. But even in its ruined state, I could feel the weight of history, the echoes of forgotten prayers and whispered confessions. As I moved deeper into the church, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the stone floor, just in front of the ruined altar, were symbols. Strange, unfamiliar symbols, unlike anything I had ever seen before. They were intricate and complex, almost hypnotic in their design. I felt a strange pull towards them, a compelling urge to touch them, to understand them. I resisted the urge, my instincts screaming at me to stay away. I took a photograph of the symbols, making a note to research them later. Then, I turned and left the church, feeling a sense of unease that lingered in the air. I explored the rest of the town, moving from ruin to ruin. I saw the remains of houses, shops, a schoolhouse, a general store. Each building was filled with the same oppressive silence, the same sense of decay and abandonment. In the schoolhouse, I found a child's notebook, its pages filled with childish drawings and clumsy handwriting. The last entry was dated over 100 years ago. It was a simple sentence: "The dark man comes for us." The dark man? Who was the dark man? And what had he done to Silent Hollow? As I delved deeper into the ruins, I began to feel a growing sense of dread. The silence seemed to intensify, the shadows seemed to lengthen, and the feeling of being watched became almost unbearable. I kept thinking about the disappearances, the whispered legends, and the strange lights in the sky. It all felt connected, part of some dark, incomprehensible puzzle. In the center of the town square, I noticed a well. It was old and overgrown, the stone rim crumbling and covered in moss. I shone my flashlight down into the well, but the darkness was absolute. I couldn't see the bottom. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to throw something into the well, just to break the silence. I picked up a small stone from the ground and tossed it into the darkness. It seemed to fall for an eternity before I heard a faint splash. The sound echoed up from the depths of the well, distorted and amplified by the silence. And then, I heard something else. A whisper. It was faint and indistinct, barely audible above the sound of the rain. But it was there. A whisper that seemed to come from the depths of the well, a whisper that spoke my name. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I strained my ears, trying to decipher the whisper. It came again, clearer this time. "Come down." The voice was deep and guttural, almost inhuman. It resonated in my bones, filling me with a terror I had never experienced before. I stumbled backward, away from the well, my flashlight beam shaking wildly. I wanted to run, to escape Silent Hollow, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I was paralyzed by fear. The whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. "Come down. We're waiting for you." I squeezed my eyes shut, covering my ears with my hands, trying to block out the voice. But it was no use. It was inside my head, resonating in my mind, driving me insane. I opened my eyes, my gaze drawn back to the well. The darkness seemed to writhe and churn, as if something was moving within its depths. And then, I saw them. Faces. Pale, distorted faces, emerging from the darkness of the well. Their eyes were black and empty, their mouths stretched into silent screams. They reached out towards me, their skeletal hands clawing at the air. I screamed, a primal scream of terror that echoed through the ruins of Silent Hollow. I turned and ran, stumbling blindly through the darkness, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I didn't know where I was going, I didn't care. All I wanted to do was escape, to get away from the well, from the faces, from the whispering. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs ached. I ran until I couldn't run anymore. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, my body trembling uncontrollably. I looked back towards the town. The well was still there, a dark, gaping hole in the center of the ruins. The faces were gone, but I could still hear the whispering, faint but persistent, like a haunting echo. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to get out of Silent Hollow, before whatever was in that well came for me. I forced myself to my feet and stumbled back towards the jeep. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life. I slammed the jeep into gear and sped away, back down the narrow, overgrown road, away from Silent Hollow. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main highway, surrounded by the familiar lights and sounds of civilization. I pulled over to the side of the road, shut off the engine, and sat there, shaking, trying to catch my breath. I looked back towards the mountains, towards the darkness where Silent Hollow lay hidden. I knew I would never forget what I had seen there, what I had heard there. The faces in the well, the whispering voice, the oppressive silence. They would haunt me for the rest of my life. I spent the next few days researching Silent Hollow, trying to understand what had happened there. I pored over old newspapers, historical records, anything I could find. I discovered that Silent Hollow had been a thriving town in the late 1800s, a close-knit community of farmers and miners. But then, something terrible had happened. A series of mysterious deaths had plagued the town. People had gone missing, their bodies later found mutilated and drained of blood. Others had simply vanished without a trace. The townsfolk had blamed a number of things, wild animals, a traveling band of outlaws, even a curse. But the truth was far more disturbing. A cult had taken root in Silent Hollow, a group of people who worshipped an ancient, malevolent entity that they believed lived beneath the town. They had performed rituals, sacrifices, all in an attempt to appease the entity and gain its favor. But their actions had only angered the entity, unleashing a wave of terror upon the town. The disappearances, the deaths, the strange lights in the sky, it was all the work of the entity, feeding on the fear and despair of the townsfolk. Eventually, the remaining residents of Silent Hollow had fled, abandoning the town to the entity and its cult. The town had slowly crumbled, becoming a forgotten ruin, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, a place where the entity could still exert its influence. The cult, however, had never truly disappeared. They had gone underground, waiting for the right time to re-emerge, to resurrect their dark god and claim the world for themselves. I realized then that I had stumbled upon something far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. I had awakened something that should have remained buried, something that now knew I was looking for it. I knew I had to warn people, to expose the cult and their dark god before it was too late. But I also knew that they would be watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I published my story, detailing the history of Silent Hollow, the disappearances, the cult, and the entity in the well. I provided the photographs I had taken, including the images of the strange symbols. The story went viral. People were fascinated, horrified, and skeptical. Some dismissed it as a hoax, a work of fiction. Others believed it, and started their own investigations into Silent Hollow and the surrounding area. I received countless emails and messages, some from people who claimed to have had similar experiences in the Appalachian Mountains, others from people who warned me to stop, to leave the past alone. I ignored the warnings, determined to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Then, the disappearances started again. People who had read my story, people who had visited Silent Hollow, people who had shown an interest in the cult, they started to vanish. Their disappearances were eerily similar to the disappearances from Silent Hollow over a century ago. I realized then that the cult was still active, that they were using my story to find new victims, to feed their dark god. I was horrified. I had inadvertently led people to their deaths. I was responsible. I decided to go back to Silent Hollow. I had to stop the cult, to put an end to the disappearances, to silence the entity in the well. I knew it was a suicide mission. I knew I was walking into a trap. But I couldn't live with the guilt of knowing that I had led innocent people to their doom. I packed my jeep with supplies, weapons, and research materials. I wrote a letter to my editor, explaining everything, and telling him to publish it if I didn't return. Then, I drove back to the Appalachian Mountains, back to the Devil's Teeth, back to Silent Hollow. The rain was falling again, a cold, relentless rain that mirrored the darkness in my heart. The road was slick and treacherous, the trees looming and menacing. I arrived in Silent Hollow late at night. The town was even more desolate and oppressive than I remembered. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of the rain and the frantic beating of my own heart. I parked the jeep in the town square and stepped out into the darkness. I was armed with a pistol, a shotgun, and a knife. I was ready for anything. I made my way to the church, the place where I had first seen the strange symbols. I wanted to examine them more closely, to see if I could decipher their meaning. As I approached the church, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were people inside. Silhouetted against the faint light of the moon, I could see figures moving inside the ruined church. They were chanting, their voices a low, guttural hum that resonated in the air. The cult. They were performing a ritual. I crept closer, cautiously, my pistol raised. I peered through a gap in the ruined wall and saw them. They were gathered around the altar, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. They were chanting in a language I didn't understand, their voices growing louder and more frenzied. In the center of the altar, I saw something that made my stomach churn. A body. It was a young woman, bound and gagged. She was alive, but barely conscious. Her eyes were wide with terror. The cult was preparing to sacrifice her. I couldn't let that happen. I burst into the church, firing my pistol into the air. The chanting stopped. The cultists turned towards me, their faces hidden beneath their hoods. "Stop!" I shouted. "Let her go." The cultists didn't move. They just stood there, staring at me, their eyes like black pits in the darkness. Then, one of them stepped forward. He was taller than the others, his hood pulled back to reveal a gaunt, pale face. His eyes were cold and cruel. "You should not have come back," he said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "You have disturbed our work." "Your work is evil," I said. "You're going to hurt that girl." "She is a sacrifice," the cult leader said. "An offering to our God." "Your God is a monster," I said. The cult leader smiled, a chilling, unsettling smile. "Our God is power. Our God is vengeance. Our God will consume you all." He raised his hand, and the other cultists surged forward, their hands reaching for me. I opened fire, blasting the cultists with my pistol and shotgun. They fell to the ground, screaming and writhing. But there were too many of them. They kept coming, their numbers overwhelming me. I fought them off as best I could, but I was outnumbered and outgunned. They tackled me to the ground, pinning me down. The cult leader approached me, his eyes filled with triumph. "It is your turn to be sacrificed," he said. He raised a knife above me, ready to plunge it into my chest. I closed my eyes, bracing for the pain. But it never came. Suddenly, a guttural roar echoed through the church. The cultists screamed in terror, releasing me and scrambling backward. I opened my eyes and saw it. The entity. It had emerged from the well, its form a swirling mass of darkness and shadows. Its eyes were like burning coals, its mouth a gaping maw filled with razor-sharp teeth. It lunged at the cult leader, tearing him apart with its claws. The other cultists screamed and scattered, trying to escape. But there was nowhere to run. The entity was too fast, too powerful. It slaughtered them one by one, tearing them limb from limb, devouring their souls. I watched in horror, paralyzed by fear. The entity was a nightmare made flesh, a creature of pure evil. When it had finished with the cultists, it turned its attention to me. Its burning eyes locked onto mine. It stalked towards me, its massive form casting a long, ominous shadow. I knew I was going to die. There was no escape. I was at the mercy of the entity, a creature that had haunted Silent Hollow for centuries. It reached out towards me, its skeletal hand extended. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. But it never came. Instead, I felt a cold, clammy hand grip mine. I opened my eyes and saw her. The young woman from the altar. She had freed herself from her bonds and was standing beside me, her eyes wide with terror. "Come with me," she whispered. "I know how to stop it." I didn't hesitate. I took her hand, and we ran. We ran out of the church, out of the town, out of Silent Hollow. We ran until we were miles away, back on the main highway, surrounded by the familiar lights and sounds of civilization. We stopped at a gas station, gasping for breath, our bodies trembling uncontrollably. I looked at the young woman, trying to understand what had just happened. "Who are you?" I asked. She looked at me with sad, knowing eyes. "My name is Sarah," she said. "And I've been waiting for you." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Silent Hollow isn't what you think it is," she continued. "The cult, the entity, it's all a lie." I stared at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "Silent Hollow wasn't destroyed by a dark god," she said. "It was destroyed by fear." She went on to explain that the story of the cult and the entity was a fabrication, created by the town's founders to control the population. They had used fear and superstition to maintain their power, to keep the townsfolk in line. The disappearances and deaths were not the work of a supernatural entity, but rather the result of infighting, greed, and paranoia within the community. The cult was simply a group of power-hungry individuals who had used the legend of the entity to justify their own evil deeds. The entity in the well wasn't a monster, but a manifestation of the town's collective fear, a phantom born from the darkness of their own hearts. Sarah revealed that she was a descendant of one of the original founders of Silent Hollow, a woman who had tried to expose the truth about the town's dark secret. But she had been silenced, her story buried, her memory erased. Sarah had been trapped in Silent Hollow for over a century, her spirit tethered to the town, forced to relieve the horrors of its past. She had been waiting for someone to come along, someone who could expose the truth and break the cycle of fear. That person was me. "You're not a journalist," Sarah said. "You're a catalyst. You brought the fear to the surface, forcing the truth to be revealed." I stared at her, stunned. Everything I thought I knew about Silent Hollow was a lie. The story I had chased, the mystery I had tried to solve, it was all based on a false narrative. "But the faces in the well," I said. "The whispering voice. I saw them. I heard them." Sarah smiled sadly. "Those were echoes of the town's past, manifestations of the fear and despair that still linger in Silent Hollow. They're not real, not in the way you think. They're just memories." I realized then that she was right. Silent Hollow wasn't haunted by a supernatural entity, but by the ghosts of its own past, by the darkness that had festered within its walls. The real monster wasn't the entity in the well, but the fear itself, the fear that had driven the town to madness and destruction. I looked back towards the mountains, towards the darkness where Silent Hollow lay hidden. I knew that the town would never truly be at peace until the truth was revealed, until the cycle of fear was broken. I knew what I had to do. I turned to Sarah. "Will you help me?" I asked. She nodded, her eyes filled with determination. Together, we would return to Silent Hollow. We would expose the truth about the town's dark past, and we would finally lay its ghosts to rest. I never made it back to Silent Hollow. I was driving. Sarah was asleep. A truck came out of nowhere. Headlights. Impact. Screeching metal. The world went white, then black. I woke up in the hospital, disoriented and in pain. They told me I was lucky to be alive. The truck driver had been drunk. Sarah didn't make it? I grieved. I tried to make sense of it all. The truck driver. The accident. It felt deliberate. As if someone, didn't want the truth to be told. Weeks turned into months. I struggled to piece my life back together. The memories of Silent Hollow, the faces in the well, Sarah's story, they haunted my dreams. I decided I had to finish what I started. I owed it to Sarah. I owed it to the people of Silent Hollow. I started writing. I poured everything I knew, everything Sarah had told me, into the story. The real story. The story about fear, about lies, about a town consumed by its own darkness. I finished the book. I sent it to my editor. He was hesitant, skeptical. He thought I was still suffering from the trauma of the accident. But he published it. The book was a success. People were shocked, outraged. They demanded answers. They wanted to know the truth about Silent Hollow. The authorities launched an investigation. They exhumed bodies. They uncovered documents. They found evidence of the town's dark secrets. The truth about Silent Hollow was finally revealed. The cycle of fear was broken. But as the story spread, as the truth came out, something else started to happen. I started to notice things. Strange things. Whispers. Everywhere I went, I heard whispers. Faint, indistinct, barely audible whispers. Whispers that seemed to follow me, to surround me, to penetrate my mind. You should have left it alone, they whispered. You should have stayed away. I dismissed them as my imagination, the lingering effects of the trauma. But then, I started seeing them. Faces. Pale, distorted faces, appearing in the shadows, in the corners of my vision. They were fleeting, ephemeral, barely there. But they were there. Watching me. Judging me. You will pay, they whispered. You will suffer. I started to lose my mind. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think. I was constantly on edge, terrified of what was coming next. I tried to tell people what was happening, but they didn't believe me. They thought I was crazy. I was alone. Then, one night, I woke up to find them standing in my bedroom. The cultists. They were wearing their dark hoods, their faces hidden in shadow. We have been waiting for you, the cult leader said, his voice a low, menacing growl. You have disturbed our work. You have revealed our secrets. Now, you must pay the price. They grabbed me, dragged me out of bed, and carried me away. I struggled, I screamed, but it was no use. They were too strong, too many. They took me to Silent Hollow. The town was even more desolate and oppressive than I remembered. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of the rain and the frantic beating of my own heart. They dragged me to the church, the place where I had seen the entity. They tied me to the altar, the same altar where they had planned to sacrifice Sarah. The cult leader approached me, his eyes filled with triumph. It is your turn to be sacrificed, he said. Your turn to pay for your sins. He raised a knife above me, ready to plunge it into my chest. I closed my eyes, bracing for the pain. But it never came. Instead, I heard a familiar voice. Stop. I opened my eyes and saw her, Sarah. She was standing in the doorway of the church, her eyes blazing with fury. "Let him go," she shouted. The cult leader sneered. "You cannot stop us, ghost. You are powerless." Sarah stepped forward, her form shimmering and ethereal. "I am not powerless," she said. "I am the memory of Silent Hollow. I am the truth. And I will not let you desecrate this place any longer." She raised her hand, and a wave of energy surged through the church. The cultists screamed in pain, their bodies writhing and convulsing. The cult leader collapsed to the ground, his face contorted in agony. Sarah turned to me, her eyes filled with compassion. "It's over," she said. "They can't hurt you anymore." She reached out and touched me, her hand sending a jolt of energy through my body. Suddenly, I felt a surge of power, a sense of clarity and understanding. I knew what I had to do. I closed my eyes and focused my mind. I reached out to the entity in the well, the manifestation of the town's collective fear. I spoke to it, not with fear, but with compassion. I told it that it was not a monster, but a reflection of the town's pain. I told it that it deserved to be free. And then, I released it. The entity dissolved, its form fading away into nothingness. The darkness in Silent Hollow began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of peace and tranquility. The cultists were gone, their bodies reduced to dust. The church was still in ruins, but it no longer felt haunted. Silent Hollow was finally at peace. I opened my eyes and looked at Sarah. She smiled at me, a warm, loving smile. "Thank you," she said. "You did it. You freed us all." She faded away, her form dissolving into the air. I was alone in the church, surrounded by silence. But it was no longer a malevolent silence, but a peaceful one. I stood up and walked out of the church, out of the town, out of Silent Hollow. I never went back. But I never forgot what I had learned there. I learned that fear is a powerful force, a force that can consume and destroy. I learned that lies can fester and grow, poisoning the minds of those who believe them. I learned that the truth, however painful, is always the best medicine. And I learned that even in the darkest of places, there is always hope. But sometimes, the story just gets inside you. Consumes you. Makes you a part of it. It becomes you, until you're not sure where the story ends, and you begin. It blurs the lines, warps your perception. I thought I left Silent Hollow that day. But I never did. The whispers are still there. The faces still flicker at the edge of my vision. The fear, it never really goes away, does it? Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that I'm still tied to that altar, waiting for the knife to fall. And then I realize, maybe it already has. Maybe I died in that accident. Maybe everything that happened afterward was just a dream, a nightmare, a story that I told myself to make sense of the darkness. Maybe Sarah was never real. Maybe she was just a figment of my imagination, a way for me to cope with the trauma. Maybe the cultists are still out there, waiting for me, watching me. Maybe the entity is still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Maybe Silent Hollow is still a curse, a place of darkness and despair. And maybe, just maybe, I'm still trapped there, forever. But I'll never know, will I? Because the story is me, and I am the story. And the story never ends.